Sometimes when you're coding, your experience looks a little bit like this. You add some code, you try it out, does it work? If it works, great, you add some more code and keep going. If not, then you mess around and try to figure out what went wrong. Well, what we're going to be talking about today is what to do when it doesn't work and you have to mess around and figure out what went wrong. So in this case, we call it debugging. So let's look at a piece of code that's going to help us explore some common errors in programs and how to fix them. So here's this piece of code, a little debugging example, a little piece of HTML. Notice it calls the JavaScript that we care about here, debugging example. And if we look at that, we can take a quick look at it. Remember, when you're first looking at code, strategy is to get an overview. So we'll take a quick scan. We see some comments. We see that it prompts the user for a maximum value, and then it tells us it's going to print a summation table, which is sort of the sum of the numbers from 0 to whatever number the user enters. And then it's got a for loop, which goes through and it adds to the sum, this running total, and each time through it prints out the current running total for the sum. So that's sort of a quick overview of what this code does. But there's some problems here. Let's go see what happens when we run this code. So I'm going to go reload this page. Nothing showed up. Nothing at all showed up. That happens sometimes. And when it does, one of the first things I always do is go and open up the console to see if there are any error messages that are helpful. In the Mac, I can do this by going to the View menu, the Developer, and then the JavaScript console, which opens up the console, and that shows me an error message that's preventing my program from running. So a couple of things to look for in these error messages is the particular type of error. In this case, it's a syntax error. Something usually about where it thinks the problem is, where it noticed the problem, and the file and the line number that it detected the problem. So in this case, it detected a syntax error where it thinks it's missing a closing parentheses after an argument, presumably to some function call, on line 21. So let's go back to our code and look at line 21. Scroll down and we look at line 21, we see that we're trying to call document.write, which just writes some HTML into the document. And we see we've got some text, and then we concatenate it with a number, and then we go to the next line with some more text and so on. But notice what we forgot to do. We forgot that we have to include the concatenation operator at the end of the line so that it'll connect to the next line as one statement. So now JavaScript will consider this whole thing as one statement instead of thinking that I just forgot to put in a parentheses. Alright, so we found a syntax error. Let's save that and we'll go and we'll reload the page. Aha, so now it didn't generate the error message and it is asking me for the maximum value. I'll type in 5. And there it goes. Wow, we've got our table. And let's look at the table. So it's giving us a sum from 0 to 0 is 0. That makes sense. Sum from 0 to 1 is 1. That's good. Sum from 0 to 2 should be 3. There's a problem there. And the others are just obviously printing out just the same value. Should be something like 0, 1, 3, 3 plus 3 is 6, 10. So what we have here is a program that runs, but it's got a logic error, so it's not generating the correct output. These can be pretty tricky to debug, but let's go take a look at this code. Fortunately, this is small enough, so it won't be too hard to find the error. When you are trying to debug these logic errors, you don't have a specific error message that tells you look on line 7, for example. So you have to make some guesses about where you think the problem is. Very often you end up having to step through your code in your head or on paper until you find an error. As your code gets longer, sometimes you have to sort of make some guesses about where the problem might be and say, okay, I'm going to skip all of this up through line 16 because I don't think that's going to be the problem, and I'm going to start at line 18 and just sort of assume everything works up to that, okay, up till that point. So there's different strategies for where you start looking for the problems when you're debugging logic errors. In this case, I'm going to use the strategy of assuming that everything is okay up until the for loop. But then we're going to step through the for loop one step at a time. So the first time through the for loop, I is going to be 0, and sum will be 0, and sum is going to be sum plus I, so it's going to be 0 plus 0, so it's 0. So when it writes out that row of the table, I is 0, sum is 0. That's correct. Let's go back and loop up to the top now. Second time through the loop, I is 1. And now when we go to add sum is 0 plus I is 1, that gives us sum equals 1. And now we saw when it printed out the second row that second row is correct. But now let's look closely at the third row because we know that's where the problem shows up. Third time through, I is equal to 2, and sum is 0, because sum is 0 plus 2. So you start to see the problem. We probably shouldn't be, no, we definitely should not be reinitializing the value of sum to 0 at the top of the loop each time. Some of you probably saw that already, but anyway. So let's put this where it belongs. What we need to do here is, what we're trying to do is initialize the value of sum to 0 at the beginning before we start the loop. So let's move that outside of the loop. Clean up the code a little bit, remove that blank line. Now, if we start the sum at 0, and now we don't reset it to 0 each time, it should keep that running total. So let's save the code, go back and reload it, and see what happens. That looks more promising. From 0 to 0 is 0, 0 to 1 is 1, 0 to 2 is 3, 0 to 3 is 6, 0 to 4 is 10. Okay, so I think we've got that logic bug nailed. Now there's still another bug, and this bug won't necessarily show up all the time, but it's what I call a runtime bug, and it can happen depending on certain circumstances. And in this case, it can happen if when you prompt the user for the maximum value, they don't actually type a number. Let's reload that. See, if I type my name instead of a number, what happens? We get this funny thing and it doesn't actually print a table. What's going on here? Well, the basic thing is you should always validate your input and make sure that if you're expecting to get a number, you test that you really did get a number. We'll talk about validation later. But for the purposes of finding this runtime error, you just have to know that sometimes the users can enter data or other circumstances, not just data entry, but where you don't actually get a value that you're expecting to get, for example. And that can cause problems. So those are three common types of errors that you run into. In the book, they've got some, on pages 460 and 61, they've got a number of different types of errors, more specific types of errors that you might encounter also. Before we leave, there's one other problem with this code, and that has to do with the fact that there's an undeclared variable. JavaScript will let you do that, but it's not good practice. You should always declare your variables. So what I'm going to do here to flush out that error is put in a statement, the use strict statement, which basically tells the interpreter, be a bit more strict about what you expect your programs to do. And in this case, it means that if it encounters a variable that gets used before it's defined, then it generates an error. So we'll save this code, and now we'll reload it. And if I type in a 5, oops, now it detected at line 21, it detected that we used the variable I, but it wasn't defined. So we tried to reference the variable I before it was defined. So let's go back and look at line 21. Right in there in that for loop. So one way around that is to declare our variables I, which is good practice. And now if we go and reload and re-enter the 5, it works fine again. So there you have it. There's some common debugging errors that you can run into, and one good practice, which is to use the strict mode and that will help catch some undeclared variables and things like that.